És la segona trobada que fem esta tarda aquí al Recinte modernista de Sant Pau dins de la Biennal de Pensament Ciutat Oberta. És una de les perles de la Biennal i es veu per l'expectació que ha creat. És el diàleg entre l'arquitecte Carles Muro i el catedràtic en Sociologia Richard Sennett. Ells parlaran sobre la ciutat física i la ciutat viscuda. Tot teu, Carles.
Sí? Se'm sent? Se'm sent? No, per això. Se'm sent? Sí, ara se'm sent. Bueno, bona tarda a tothom. Good evening, everyone. So I just wanted to say that as a starting point, that when Richard Sennett asked me to take part in this open conversation in the context of the Barcelona Biennial, my first reaction was to say that there were lots of people in Barcelona that I believe could do a better job. And no, it's absolutely true. And I think I still believe it. But then once he insisted, here I am. And I'm not going to insist on that topic. No, but it's important to me because I really feel, on the one hand, flattered and honored. But I take this honor with an incredible responsibility because I think that's a lot of expectation. And I'll try to use myself as a vehicle for you to listen more to Richard. On the other hand, though, I wanted to say very briefly that I first met Richard, like many of you probably, through his books. And that was a long time ago. I remember when I first read Flesh and Stone. And it was a very, very important reading to me. And at the time, of course, I never imagined I would meet the man behind the book. But I was very lucky, very fortunate to meet Richard a few years ago at Harvard Graduate School of Design. We taught together, and I have to say that Richard was disproportionately generous with me and with all the students, and that's one of the reasons that I also want to be back and give some of this generosity back to him and listen to him as much as possible. So the other thing, because it's always difficult to start a conversation with someone like Richard, I would say, I thought that the best way to do that, and we've known each other now for quite a few years, and we've had many... ¿Se sent bé o no? Sí. És que jo tampoc em sento com si va perdent, no? I was saying that as we've had so many conversations so far, the best way for me was to think that that was an ongoing conversation, so that we didn't have to start, that we were continuing a much larger, much broader conversation, so that we could start from anywhere. And we've discussed lots of things. We're here today mostly with excuse of his last book, which hasn't yet been published in either Spanish, which will be published by Anagrama. I see the publisher here. And in Catalan by Arcadia, that I also saw the publishers here, Building and Dwelling, which is a fantastic book. So the first thing I would like to ask you to start the conversation would be really why, apart from the fact that we all know that you're a very disciplined person and you promised that you'd do a trilogy about Homo Faber, and you always promised there would be a third book on the city, the book on craftsmen, on the craftsmanship, the book on cooperation together, and then you said there would be a book on the city. But why really? What's your real inner need to do a book on the city, to talk about the city in 2018? Because I know that's important.
Do we have a couch? You know, I mean, this is a psychoanalytic question.
No, that's why it's important to me.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for coming. I'm delighted to have this conversation with Carlos, who's been my colleague at Harvard for a long time. And what can I tell you about this? Actually, the impulse to write this trilogy for me was a disquiet with my own teacher, who was Hannah Arendt. And Hannah Arendt wrote a famous book. I don't know what the title in Spanish is, or Catalan. It's called The Human Condition. What's it?
La condición humana in Spanish. It's the same thing, yeah.
And it's a book about the difference between making a life and enduring life. And this was a very important distinction to her between simply surviving and feeling that you actually were creating something in your life. But for her, it was all verbal. And my starting point on this, I mean, she was a wonderful and a horrible teacher, but It's a wonderfully provocative book, but it seemed to me wrong in that it concentrated too much on production as a production of speech. And I was interested in ways which were more physical about how people made things. And I'd always had this in my mind, you know, that I would someday take this up. And when I finally could, about 10 years ago, my first thought was to do something about, I thought, vaguely I thought I would write a trilogy, but I had no idea what that meant. I still don't, but anyhow, that's neither here nor there. And I wanted to do something about the relation between the hand and the head. I knew this as a musician, which is what I did in a former and better life, that physical activity and mental activity are inseparable. So when I wrote the book on craftsmanship, I wanted to look at that connection between the head and the hand. And that's never something that people do in isolation. It's always with others. And again, music was a kind of guide for me in thinking about how people cooperate with each other, and the model of a workshop as a scene for that kind of cooperation. And when I came to write this book, are you calling it Building and Dwelling or Open City? I can't remember. We'll decide. You can vote. Because it's got two titles. I wanted to understand how people build environments which are outside their environments of work. That sort of has intersected with me for a long time. I've served as a consultant to various United Nations agencies. And thanks to one close who is somewhere here tonight, there he is, we cooperated on making a project which culminated in Habitat 3 at the United Nations 2 years ago. And I wanted to bring some of that experience that I've had, not only working with Juan, but working in other parts of the UN as a planner, to bear with the differences between the way we think about making, in a Western context, an environment, and the way in which people in emerging cities in the third world think about making the environment in which they live, which is much less architectural, professional. It's much more about making the conditions, physical conditions of your housing, even your labor. I'm sorry, this is such a long-winded answer to your question, but that's what this book was about, and this trilogy was about. And the odd thing about it was that when I got to the end of this, as I now have come to, I feel that it really wouldn't be worth having an argument with Arendt about this if she was still alive today. That world of verbal making, it's also the world of Jürgen Habermas and communicative interaction. That very dematerialized world is one thing, and it's not an either or. But this is about the sensate, the material, the tactile realm of Homo Faber, and maybe someday they'll stand together with each other. So that's what I got, that's how this has come out for me.
Yeah. No, I think building from what you were saying, I think there's always something very important for those who make the city, in a sense, who is everyone, actually, not only the experts, as sometimes called urban designers and architects, about how you materialize ideas, right? And that's a process of translation which is very difficult. And you talk in your book sometimes about how you make justice physical, or how do you make a place which is there's a process of translation in a sense, but kind of is there a possibility for the translation, or how can we inform certain spaces, certain places in the city so that they're more receptive to express certain values of our society?
There's a couple of, I think there are two questions in what you raise. The idea of spatial justice is, for thinkers like Henri Lefebvre, who wrote The Right to the City,
Yep.
is a justice in terms of being able to take ownership of any part of the city. Mm-hmm. And it's a very powerful argument. It's about that you have a right to the whole city. It's an argument against the notion of community, that you have rights if you stay where you should be. Mm-hmm. If you're an immigrant, if you stay in an immigrant community, you'll be cared for, but if you stray into tourist land, you'll be moved on. And that has, I was interested in that in terms of studying the Venetian ghetto, which I wrote a little book about, because that goes all the way back to the idea of the Jewish ghetto in Venice, which is that Jews were protected there as long as they never left the ghetto. And that's a mentality, I think, that that Lefebvre brought up into the modern world. And it's not an easy one, because it says that you shouldn't belong someplace particular. It's a very demanding thing for people. The idea of spatial justice, that's his idea of spatial justice. My notion was, I admired him greatly. He was a wonderful person, very difficult, but aren't we all? And but my idea is a little different of that, which is that people have a kind of right to the city, which consists of a right to experience the complexities in it. Mm-hmm. And they have it's an odd way to think about justice, that you have a right to experience the fullness of urban life in terms of its complexities and contradictions. Most living cities are not coordinated, efficient machines. They're places in which people who are different, people who don't like each other, don't know each other, live physically together. And in my view, that's a good thing. It teaches people a basic ethical value in life, which is the limits of yourself in relation to other people. That the world is not a mirror of yourself. And my idea of spatial justice is making spaces in which that kind of complexity is allowed to flourish. I'm sorry we don't have the means to see a visual image of this. There are very concrete places in my mind from the work that I was doing as a consultant in the UN, which you will see in my book, a very cheap book. I should buy 2 copies, buy one for your mother, and so on. But it's an image of a place called Nehru Place, which is an open-air market in the south of Delhi. It's an enormously complex space that mixes Hindus, Muslims, scheduled castes. Those are, legal untouchables, as we used to call them. People of all different kinds of selling different things, doing all sorts of stuff. It is the most, it's the least violent place in Delhi, which is otherwise quite a violent city. And the reason for that is that people have had to learn to be physically in the presence of other people. That there are limits to one's identity in the midst of other people. And it's made a kind of peaceful coexistence there. That's my idea of spatial justice. It's not the right to go anywhere, but the right to have access to that kind of complexity.
Right. I didn't really want to get into spatial justice and the right to the city so soon, but I was more into materialization. No, let's then move into a slightly different thing. You mentioned in your answer a couple of times complexities and contradictions, and I think that there's also something lurking in your book about the possibility of, now that Robert Benjuri died a few weeks ago, that we're missing the equivalent to his book, Complexity and Contradiction in Architecture, for a book which could be complexities and contradictions, probably in plural, in the open space, in the public space, which is something that's a book that should be written, because can I just, because really in the example you're mentioning of Narrow Place, for instance, that's very dear to you also because of the story that got into understanding it, but then you use ambiguity, you use this difference between synchronic and sequential space, which I think that's a very important way of understanding public space in order to design space. For Richard, in that sense, saying that synchronic space is that which allows for many possible things to happen at a time, while sequential, in principle, correct me if I'm wrong, because those would be the space which is based for one single activity at a time, so that now you do that, and now you do something else, and normally you do just one thing. The examples he gives are the theater, the stadium, this sort of thing. So narrow space, which is not designed in the way that we normally understand, has this ability to support activity in a much more complex way. Yeah. And I think that's something very interesting about these complexities and contradictions, that perhaps we could also try to think more about that. Would that something that would that please you? That someone
Absolutely. Well, you put it much more clearly than I do. I actually had another thought about that, which is more social, or as social as it is architectural, which is that what we're seeing in modern society is a kind of retreat from the notion of the kind of openness which consists of confusions, ambiguities, for instance, of ethnic identity, things like that. And this was long ago by Jakob Burckhardt, the historian, was called what he called radical simplification. And I think one of the responses to the kind of economic complexities that we've had, which have crashed, is a desire to sort of retreat from the social experiences of complexity. It's something that for us as urbanists very evident in gated communities, which are the most popular forms of, if people can consume housing, that's what they want to do. They want to shut the gates. I guess I don't have to say anything about the United States in that context, but my idea about this is that planning, urban space, can work against that sort of desire to withdraw, to know who you are, to be in a clear space, to be transparent with others. All of those are bad words. And what are good words is, I don't know, or I can't quite see where the limit of this is, or even what do you think? And to get into that framework, I think that's again where the kind of physical environment is a source of, if you like, of teaching And that's when I was thinking about this synchronous, sequential thing, that we learn much more from ambiguous, lots of things happening at the same time. Also about keeping our poise, our balance, not being pulled apart by lots of different things. Whereas sequential kinds of environments are they're functional spaces that don't tell us very much. They're not very reflexive. Do you know what I mean? They're spaces in which you do something, but you don't think about yourself in relation to it or to other people in it. So that's why I make that distinction. But it's social as well as physical, which is just what we want.
Yeah.
This is what you and I taught for years at Harvard, that they're all connected.
No, but I would say that in a sense, in this distinction, any good public space we know has always been synchronic. And the perfect example of the sequential space would be the theme park, for instance. That would be, and many cities are designed nowadays as theme parks, so that you're supposed to be doing this here and that, right, the next thing there, and so on and so forth. But I wanted to bring another.
That's tourism too. Tourists.
Yeah, that's something that we will have to address in this city, actually.
Yeah. We do too in London. It's.
There's several threads we could pull, and let me know which ones you'd like to pursue more intensely. But there's one for me which is very important. Once again, the notion of difference, diversity, and the other, in a sense. This, which is very important. We all know that the same people, as I'm not quoting directly, but the same people would never make a city, as Aristotle said. So we need different people to make a city. We need to value difference of origin, difference of ethnicity, of race, of religion, of sexuality, of everything, so that we can have this place of exchange and transaction to some extent. But I think that probably you're overvaluing the figure, or idealizing almost the figure of the migrant. And I wanted to go to that because right now we have an issue with migrations in large quantities, and something that perhaps those are too many things, but I think they're really connected. We will have to very soon face seriously what is beginning to be called the climate change migrants. So people will have to move in large quantities because of sea level rise, because of lots of things like that. So how can we be more prepared as citizens, not necessarily in that sense, to welcome those? And I know.
Can't you ask me a simpler question?
Yes. What are you having for dinner?
We haven't had dinner yet. Well, I guess there are lots of things I want to say to you about
the notion of diversity linked to migrations and the ability of a city to absorb these migrants in a positive, productive way.
Well, the first thing I should tell you is that I would like to decouple the discussion about difference from discussion about immigrants.
Right.
I think it's the kind of obsession with immigrants, kind of like masturbation on the right. You know, it's backward looking, gives rightists lots of pleasure and so on. And to me, having grown up in New York and now living in London, both of which are cities full of migrants, this is much less important to me than how people of different economic strata live to each other. That's a much more grinding question about how the rich and poor live together, because this tendency to sort of clarify and move things in is very class-bound. Mm-hmm. Middle-class people do not want to live mixed with poor people, and it's one of the deep drivers of gentrification, at least in London and New York, that it's not just it is an economic process, but it's something in which the mixture of classes is something that middle-class people don't want, and they act on it. This is a long, long subject, and again, if you read my wonderfully inexpensive book, I go into this. But the point I want to make to you about this is that it's an ethical issue, which is that the poor are really being expelled from this range of complexity that we think of in the city. It's a very grinding issue to us in London because this is happening in schools. And we're arranging the school system so that middle-class children, by and large, don't grow up with poor children. They get a better education. Poor children get a worse one. And it's for the sake of the children that there's that kind of expulsion. And I think we're going to have to face that. That's a real problem of difference, which is not a masturbatory problem of, oh, I only feel good with people who are like me, you know? And because cities are places in which the middle class and lower middle class particularly have very troubled existences, that the tendency to want to withdraw, neoliberal capitalism, very unstable phenomenon, is part of that. I also feel this in terms of, which is correlated to this, in terms of age, which is, the young are also being expelled in this system from having a more complicated life. They live longer with their parents. Their jobs are not jobs that create, these 0-hour short-term contract jobs, are not ways of installing people in the city. So I don't mean to make a long speech. Well, actually, I do mean to make a long speech of this. I just think we should stop worrying about migration. Think like New Yorkers, who just naturalize it. And worry about something that's much, much more of the moment, which is, what do we do with people who are unequal? How can they live together economically? It seems to me far, far more important than worrying about cultural differences. I think it's as complete. I think it's just completely backward.
I fully agree. And I have to say that there's an incredible presence of the notion of the other in your book, and I recently read this beautiful book by Toni Morrison.
Oh yeah.
What's the formation? No, the origin of others. The origin
the
of others.
Origin of Others.
Which
a wonderful
is,
book.
Yeah, which is also her talks at her Norton lectures at Harvard.
Yeah.
Which is a fantastic book about how we originate this condition. But you're absolutely right. But it's not so present in your book that one of the key issues of the contemporary city is inequality, and that we as designers, as urban designers, we do probably have some. My position would be that we normally think that sociologists, economists, politicians have to resolve that. But my intuition is that we can do quite a bit more also as designers. Do you share that view?
Not really.
No, it's interesting.
No, I'll tell you why. I don't think.
Because we normally tend to think we can do very much, and that's also, if we wait for the politicians to make the first move, for economists to really tell us what to do or whatever. I think some physical conditions of the city are partly responsible for that inequality very seriously.
Yeah, that I agree with. But don't you think that there is a great tendency to think, again goes back to this thing of limits, that we could design a city which would effectively counteract against the political economy. Mm-hmm. There's a kind of grandiosity, I feel, it's either complicity, architects, we don't want to talk about those architects, but there is a feeling, I think somehow, that design can be transformative.
Uh-huh.
And that I don't believe that. I mean, like any act of making, every act of making is limited. Everything. There are no consummations for makers. And that includes us, you know. There are alternatives, the ways of looking forward. But it's why when, you know, I don't know how many of you have ever read a book by Corbusier, Radiant City. This is a book which solves the problem of modernity. It's all there, it's all solved. That's a kind of arrogance which I think that we, as designers, want to avoid. I mean, we can contribute something, but the notion that there is an answer, whether it could be found in politics or found in design, there is an answer for every problem, is something I just don't think is possible. Maybe that's because I'm getting old, you know, but I think there are many answers, and each one of them is flawed.
No, I fully agree. I didn't mean that. What I meant was that perhaps to some extent we can inform the problems in a slightly different way.
How would you do that?
I'm not absolutely certain, but I think, for instance, there's this, of course, nothing further away from my thinking than certain design or environmental determinism. Well, I don't believe in that.
I know you don't.
And you know that.
I'm just provoking.
No, that's why. So that's
so
no,
play with
but
me.
But in the end, things do affect the way we behave, and that's part of the thinking behind your book. Also, that the environments in which this room affects the way we organize ourselves, the way we look at each other, the way we the way we establish social relationships, and the way we sit around the table for dinner. It's also so spatial relationships do shape things in many ways. And I think there might be some sort of very small contribution, and that's why one of the things that I like about your first chapter, which I think it should be compulsory for high school students.
Absolutely.
The first chapter.
And in hardcover.
First chapter, photocopied. No, I think really one of the important things is that there's, I got it lost now. Sorry about that.
You mean that the environment is, in a way, physical environment is a shaper of people's values and so on, of course.
Yeah.
And I must say my friend is very modest, and
That's where I was going, actually. I was going about your contribution to modesty as a way of making modest contributions to the art of city making, also to some extent.
Well, that's one word you could use for it. I think about this whole problem of that every time. It's something I've learned from the teaching I've done with engineers, that every time you solve a problem, you should open up a new one. And in the history of tool use, for instance, when people found, I'll give you an example of this. There was a certain point in the early 17th century where it was possible to make knives of sharpened steel, much better than the tempered knives that were used before. It took doctors about 70 years to figure out how to use these sharp knives. There were many patients who probably died in surgery to do this. But it's oftentimes a tool appears in advance of how we know how to use it. So that our relation to it, if it's a good tool, is always one that I wouldn't say we should be modest, of course, but it's one in which the use of something, that use comes after the existence of something. And that's as true in the environment as it is in making a physical thing like a sharp scalpel. I give an example of this in the environment. We still haven't figured out how to use elevators. Elevator is an incredibly isolating tool. You know, it goes to a floor, you go up this thing. It's the only public space, really, in most buildings. And you wouldn't think, for instance, to eat lunch in an elevator or to have a conversation with somebody else in it. So that's a tool we don't know how to use yet for a sociable purpose. And what I'm after in this, I get it is a kind of modesty, but it's also a kind of understanding of when you make something that you will, it's Pandora's box, that you will release something that you don't know how to use. Can I say one more thing about this? Behind that, for me, which you'll read in this book, is a kind of thinking about open systems. A closed system is one in which there's an absolutely tight correlation between an object and its use. You use this for this. It's the same thing if you write a law. This law applies that, and not that, and that. That's a tight fit between form and function, which closes down the form. And in an open system, there's experiment with forms after they're made. And it means that there's a much looser relationship between form and function, and that the form is ambiguous in its value. That should have been what happened with the internet. But it was closed down. It's very rigid. It's a very rigid system now, and very profitable to monopolies because of that. It's absolutely predictable. A malign social site like Facebook is more and more definitional of who's doing what, so how you can target, influence, desire, and so on. Here's a tool that we still don't have any idea how to use in a way which is experimental, which can evolve, you know?
Yeah.
So that's what I'm trying to get at in these books.
Yeah.
How is it that we can open up to think more in an open systems way about making things?
But we've really had many great thinkers discuss that perhaps the city is one of the greatest inventions of mankind. And I believe that that's because it can only be an open system. There's no way it can be anything but an open system, sincerely. Don't you think so? No, sincerely,
I think so.
Because there's the level of as a very complex set of systems, both physical and social, and the requests of parameters that sometimes are at odds with each other, that you need to give some priorities at different times, and different people would give different priorities and different hierarchies to the layers. I think it cannot be but an open system. Despite beyond issues of growth, which are obvious, but even without an issue of growth for the city,
I agree with that.
Has no possibility unless it's an open system full of biodiversity or full of citizen diversity, in a sense, I would say.
So would you include conflict in that as
Absolutely.
well?
Absolutely.
So would I.
Absolutely. By the way, one thing
And
that you were saying...
you are a good Catalan in that leads in I don't even want to say the word anarchism. You didn't hear me say it.
Conflict is desirable in the city, but the right type of conflict. I wanted to say, by the way, just one thing, because I'm also getting quite fascinated by lifts and elevators. So that in Barcelona, by the way, they have been one of the key elements of socialization in most of the apartment buildings. And this thing that you talk about also in your book about dialogics or whatever, this moment in which you don't really care, but you ask your neighbor something about the weather, something about whatever, that's happened as a little boy. that's the only thing I saw my mother doing with my neighbors or whatever. My mother didn't care at all, of course, but that was a thing that allowed for some sort of fluid sharing of an apartment building of
yes, no, I can
18 or 20 neighbors, you know, just like
I can see that.
It's a very
but your mother, I don't imagine your mother ever asked a neighbor, and what is your view of Hegel's synthetic...
Because that was not part of her agenda, because you didn't meet my mother, that's the thing.
I see.
That's the thing. Anyway, I think that we should open if you agree,
absolutely,
the questions to the floor.
I'm sorry we started so late,
that's why.
and that's kept you all from a drink and me from a drink and dinner. But I'd be glad to answer questions or whatever you want to ask me. Don't be shy.
We can talk for hours, but it'd be really nice to hear some more voices here.
Juan, ask me a question. Yeah.
Teniu els micros per aquí? No. Gràcies, Aura.
I've been very interested in listening to you about Hannah Arendt and then making things, the verbalism versus manipulation, doing with the hands, not manipulation in the other sense. But how politics enter in building the city, politics in the traditional sense, in the fight of power. How we introduce, because now with the postmodernism, I think that is something that the right has learned faster than the left,
right.
And it's to manipulate.
Yeah. Well, I can only say for myself that I don't think that if I look at my writing, I don't think I have much to say about politics. I am just a garden variety socialist, you know. I'd like to see monopolies broken up, you know. But I don't think the point of my writing is to offer a political solution to how to live. And that was part of my debate with Arendt, because for Arendt, the moment that you are engaged in the verbal world, you are, of course, engaged in a world of politics. And for me, you can say, of course, there are politics of objects, there are power relations in all objects. But there's something I found rather stifling about the usual way in which this is discussed. And that is to look at, it's something I learned from Bruno Latour, that an object, a physical object, has an agency and being of its own. Mm-hmm. It's not just a representation or used as an instrument of power. It has something in and of itself which has agency. If you take the scalpel example, for instance, that thing has a power in itself. It's a sharp knife. And merely saying that, well, I know you would never say this because you're a doctor, but merely saying, well, the only value of it to society was that the surgeons could perform more operations, so therefore they could make more money. It's a kind of reductivism that has dogged the study of material world. And what I would like to see is that, you know, there's a kind of pornography about power, that it's always this hidden truth that's really the secret of what's going on. That may be true, but it, like any kind of pornography, it's paralyzing. It paralyzes what you think reality is. So I'm much more, personally, I'm just saying this as a part of this project. I'm much more interested in looking things where we don't know what power they contain as useful objects or as useful structures, but that they have some kind of potency in themselves to be explored without grasping, without reducing them to kind of symbols of capitalism or nationalism or whatever. That's not it's not a whole answer. It's just where I come from as an analyst and as a researcher. I'd like to liberate objects from politics of that sort. Does it make sense? That's where I'm at in this. Let's take one more question. It's late and I'm tired, and you must be hungry. Yes, ask me a question.
There's two questions. I saw one here and one over there, and we'll close that. Yeah.
Okay. Tell me who you are.
Tomoko Sakamoto.
What?
No, Fanage Tomoko.
Here, I give you mine.
No, wait,
She's a Catalan Japanese.
I'm Tomoko. I'm from Tokyo, Japan, and I live here in Barcelona. I'm immigrant, so I live in Barcelona for 20 years. I'm half immigrant and half foreigners, half visitors, and so on. And I wanted to ask you opinion about Barcelona. Could be about the city itself, or could be about anything you saw in Barcelona. From the one thing is professional point of view, and the second thing is a personal, could be emotional point of view.
Okay. Well, from the professional point of view, this part of this chapter that you kindly referred to is about Serdar, who is for me one of the pillars of modern urbanism. And I think there are lots of things to be learned from the Serdar example in Barcelona about how to combine scale, large scale, with a humane environment. And so that's a theme throughout my book. Personally, I've had a pretty intense relationship with your city. My parents, my whole family fought in the Spanish Civil War, and before they fled across the sea, they lived for a year in Barcelona. My father was a translator of Catalan poetry, so my dear friend Javier Ruberto-Ventos brought me back to the city even before Franco had collapsed by about 6 months, I think. So I am, I'm very deeply bonded by family to Barcelona. I can't speak a word of Catalan. My father occasionally would recite Catalan poetry to me. It sounded wonderful, but anyhow, that's my personal relation to Barcelona. It goes way back in our family.
Y había la María, ¿no? Sí.
My name is Maria Cisternas. I'm an architect and a planner, and I'm from Barcelona, but I've lived abroad. My question would be, since we have an audience who comes we have an audience that comes from the architectural and planning sector. What sort of tools do you think, or maybe you have examples that you can share, that foster this idea of the open city?
Okay. Have you got about 5 hours? I tell you 3 that I'm very interested in. First, I'm very interested in the edges between territories in the city and the edges in time between activities structured in the different parts of the day. What I think for planners we need to do is, rather than look at the center of communities, we need to look at at where they touch on other communities. When I worked as a planner in New York, this translated for me in not being very, well, I give you an example of this. I worked on a project that made a market for Spanish Harlem, and we put it in the center of Spanish Harlem. We should have put it on the edge of Spanish Harlem, which is just next to one of the richest communities in the world, at the Upper East Side, so that that object, that market, was there for a maid and her employer in furs, who are both buying a quart of milk to be mixed together, other than in this employer-employer relations. But what I mean in general about this is that we should be looking at activating edges as planners. I think we should do a lot more, secondly, with experiments with incomplete forms. Most of the buildings that we make are finished. They go to a set of specifications, usually over-specified form, which means that it's very difficult for them to change as the society changes. An example of that is I worked on housing projects in Beijing during the 90s. That was a time when the Chinese government had this rather strict one-child policy. And we built small apartments on the assumption that families would have one child. Now, life has changed in Beijing. It's very difficult to convert these cells of one-child family apartments into something that can accommodate 2 or 3, even 3 children. We should have built with a much looser specification of how to do that. And my center at the London School of Economics is experimenting exactly with how to build high density but flexible, incompletely fashioned structures so that they can adapt, so that they can move. I'm also very interested, particularly for poor communities, in ways that planners can give people a sense of ownership over the community by investing in what seem to be trivia. That is street furniture. I've been arguing in London that the mayors should provide 50,000 window boxes for people to grow plants in. These all seem trivial in planning because they're about, they're about decoration. But it's in fact that sort of thing that allows people taking care of a window box or taking care of a plot of land or having a place to sit outside, a bench, things like that, are all ways of imposing value on places that don't seem to have value. And I'd like to see, the reason I tell you this, I'd like to see planners and architects experiment with cheap, uncostly, impermanent, trivial kinds of structures which people can use and feel that they take ownership on. And it's very hard to get, there's nothing heroic about that. And it's very hard to break a kind of architectural mindset among, our sort of architects, not the commercial ones, that somehow architecture is a heroic practice, and that dealing with poor people means engaging in a kind of heroism. So, we use the word modesty. That's a kind of modesty on the architect's part. So I think if what we did is focus in cities more on the interstices, on the edges, on the edge condition between different communities, if we spent more effort in trying to think how to create incomplete structures that could be used in many different ways, which were not highly specified, which didn't have that complete form-function relationship. And if we looked at the imposition of arbitrary value through modest interventions in a community, I think we'd begin to open up the city. So that's...
I think we have to close. I sincerely recommend the reading of this book, and I swear I don't have any personal profit. But what I wanted to say about it is that one should not look for any answers in this book, but I think Richard has managed to inform the questions and to make us richer, both as citizens and as designers. So thank you, Richard, for being here, and thank you for being the way you are.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Moltes gràcies a tots dos per aquestes fantàstiques reflexions sobre les complexitats de la societat i la ciutat contemporànies. Demà seguim amb més Biennal i més oberta. Si heu aconseguit un programa demà, aquí ho teniu tot, absolutament tot, explicat amb detall. Segur que a la sortida també en trobeu. És impossible destacar totes les activitats que hi ha demà perquè n'hi ha moltíssimes, però sí que us comentaré les que farem aquí al Recinte modernista de Sant Pau. A les 6 en punt, una conversa entre Jane Lazar i Belo Lich sobre la maternitat i l'activisme, i just després, a 7:15, una conversa entre el neurocirurgià Henry Marsh i la periodista Eva Piqué sobre la necessària humanització de la medicina. Moltes gràcies i fins demà.